Daniel Reeves had spent his life chasing stories. Stories bound in cracked leather, hidden in attic trunks, or sold for a fraction of their worth at estate sales. There was something sacred about the scent of old paper and ink, something that called to him more deeply than any human connection ever had. His collection was more than a hobby. It was an obsession. Rare books, first editions, forbidden texts, each one a piece of history that only a select few could appreciate. It was at a small estate auction in the countryside that he first laid eyes on it. Nestled between stacks of dust-ridden volumes and forgotten family heirlooms sat a single, unmarked tome. Its cover was dark, appearing almost organic, like aged, dried skin. There was no title, no author, no indication of what lay within. The moment Daniel touched it, a chill ran down his spine. The leather was too soft, too warm, as if it were alive. An elderly man, the apparent owner of the estate, noticed Daniel's fixation and hobbled over. His cloudy eyes locked onto Daniel's hands as they traced the cover. "You don't want that one," the old man croaked. Daniel looked up, startled. "Why? What is it?" The man hesitated, then exhaled a shaky breath. "It's cursed. I tried to get rid of it years ago, but it always comes back. You don't understand. Once you open it, it knows you." Daniel had heard many such superstitions before. Collectors thrived on them. Tales of haunted manuscripts and books that drove their readers mad. It was all part of the mystique. Still, there was something unsettling in the old man's tone, something that sent a ripple of unease through Daniel's chest. But curiosity was stronger than caution. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "I'll take it." The old man's eyes darkened, but he said nothing more. His withered hands accepted the money with reluctance. "Don't say I didn't warn you." That night, Daniel sat in his dimly lit apartment, the book resting before him on his mahogany desk. He studied it, running his fingers along its unmarked spine. There was no sign of a publisher, no embossed insignia. It was as if it had been crafted outside the known world. The pages, yellowed with age, crinkled slightly under his fingertips. Finally, he opened it. A single drop of crimson welled up from the spine and slid down the gutter of the first page. Daniel froze. His mind struggled to rationalize what he was seeing. The page wasn't stained. The blood was fresh, warm. He touched it, rubbing it between his fingers. It was unmistakably real. His pulse quickened, but excitement quickly overtook fear. It had to be an old trick, perhaps an ink that reacted to air exposure, a gimmick from some forgotten magician's library. Yet, as he turned the pages, more blood seeped out, forming thin rivulets along the edges. It smelled metallic, raw. Then he saw his name, Daniel Reeves, scrawled in perfect, flowing script at the top of the page, as though it had always been there. Below it, a passage detailed his exact actions from the moment he had entered his apartment. His heart slammed against his ribs. He flipped ahead, skimming through paragraphs that should not exist, words that should not be there. Then he reached a section that described him reading these very words right now. His breath hitched. He turned the page frantically, searching for an explanation. And that was when he saw it. A new passage was forming at the bottom of the page. The ink, if it was ink at all, was appearing in real time, as if unseen hands were writing as he watched. Daniel Reeves looks up from a book. His skin is clammy. The air around him grows thick, suffocating. He feels eyes on him, though he is alone. He glances toward the window, expecting darkness. Daniel's head jerked up instinctively. The window, beyond the glass, the city lights flickered against the midnight sky. Everything appeared normal, but the book continued writing. His gaze snapped back to the page. But there is something there, a shadow, pressed against the glass, a shape that does not belong. Daniel's entire body stiffened. His stomach turned to ice. Slowly, dreading what he would see, he turned his head back toward the window. And there it was, a figure, featureless and tall, its silhouette impossibly thin against the glass, watching him from the other side. Daniel shoved back from his desk with a choked breath. His chair toppled over, crashing to the floor. But when he dared to look again, the figure was gone. The window was empty. His pulse pounded in his ears. His first instinct was to shut the book, to get it away from him. But as he reached forward, his fingers hesitated. He needed to understand. He needed to know how this was possible. He forced himself to read the next line. Daniel Reeves will make a choice. But no matter what he chooses, the book will not leave him. It is his now. It always has been. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. He slammed the book shut, chest rising and falling rapidly. The air in his apartment felt stifling, as if unseen walls were closing in. He grabbed the book and marched toward the kitchen. He would burn it, destroy it, whatever it took. But just as he reached for a match, a thick drop of something warm slid down his wrist. He looked down. Blood. His own hands were smeared with it, though there was no wound, no source. And then the book, clenched tightly in his other hand, suddenly pulsed, like a heartbeat. Daniel dropped it with a strangled cry, watching in horror as the cover flexed, the veins beneath the leather shifting like something alive. The book twitched as if it had taken a slow, deliberate breath. And then, against all logic, the cover parted, like lips curling into a grin. Daniel stood frozen, his breath shallow. The book lay at his feet, unmoving now, its twisted grin vanishing the moment he had dropped it. But the memory of that impossible sight burned in his mind. A rational voice inside him screamed that it wasn't real, that stress, lack of sleep, or some trick of the light had warped his perception. But the scent of blood still lingered in the air. His hands still trembled with the phantom sensation of the pulsing leather cover. He had to get rid of it. Without another thought, Daniel grabbed a plastic bag from under the sink, shoved the book inside, and tied it tightly. He rushed to his apartment door, slipping on his sneakers with frantic movements. The stairwell smelled of mildew and old wood as he hurried down, gripping the bag like it was something venomous. Outside, the cold night air bit at his skin. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional passing car. He walked briskly, his eyes scanning for a place to dispose of the cursed object. An alleyway dumpster. Perfect. With a final glance around, he heaved the bag into the bin and let the lid slam shut. A wave of relief washed over him. It was gone, but as he turned to leave, a whisper snaked through the air, low and almost imperceptible. Daniel. He spun around. The alley was empty. A trick of the wind, he told himself. Just my nerves. He forced himself to walk away, not looking back. By the time he reached his apartment, he felt lighter, saner. The logical part of his brain took over again. He had let his imagination run wild. The book was just that, a book. An old, rotting trick of ink and binding. He took a deep breath and locked his door. And then he saw it. The book, sitting on his desk. The same book he had just thrown away. The plastic bag was gone, as if it had never existed. Blood smeared its edges, fresh and wet. Daniel's stomach twisted. His knees weakened, barely holding him upright. No, this wasn't possible. He approached it slowly, pulse hammering in his throat. The book lay still, its cover inert, as if mocking him with its ordinary presence. But the pages had changed. The words were different now. Daniel Reeves threw me away. Daniel Reeves thought he was free. But Daniel Reeves belongs to me now. Daniel staggered back, knocking into his chair. His vision swam, ball rising in his throat. This was not a prank. This was not a trick. The book was alive, and it wasn't letting him go. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of his apartment, knees drawn to his chest, staring at the book like it was a predator poised to strike. His body ached with exhaustion, but every time his eyelids drooped, a sharp pulse of fear jolted him awake. The book hadn't moved. It simply rested on his desk, waiting. But the words inside had changed again. Daniel Reeves will not sleep tonight. Daniel Reeves will watch. Daniel Reeves will understand. His breath came in shallow gasps. He needed help. His hand shook as he grabbed his phone. Who could he call? The police? They'd think he was insane. A friend? He barely had any. His job as a rare book collector and seller kept him isolated. No, he needed answers. His fingers hesitated before typing into his laptop's search bar. Unmarked book that bleeds. When opened, he scrolled frantically through the results. Urban legends, horror fiction, obscure occult references. Nothing concrete. Nothing that explained this. Then one link caught his eye. A deep web forum dedicated to cursed artifacts. One thread title stood out. The book that remembers you. His heart pounded as he clicked. The original post was over a decade old. The user, long inactive, described a book eerily similar to his. An unmarked tome, leather-bound, seemingly alive. They wrote about how the book knew them, how it recorded their actions as they happened, how it bled. Daniel's breath hitched. The final line of the post made his blood run cold. It won't let me go. It won't let any of us go. Beneath it, a string of replies. Most were dismissive, accusations of a hoax, of a failed horror story attempt. But one response stood out. If you have the book, do not read your name inside it. Do not acknowledge it. Burn it before it writes too much. Daniel's stomach twisted. Too late. A noise broke through his thoughts. A soft, wet drip. He turned toward his desk. Blood, seeping from the book's spine, trailing down its cover, staining the wood beneath. And then the pages fluttered. A windless, silent movement. The book was turning its own pages. Daniel bolted upright, knocking over his chair. The pages stopped. One was torn, a small rip near the center. And beneath it, new words forming. Not in ink, in red. Daniel Reeves is afraid. Daniel Reeves cannot run. Daniel Reeves will see. His breath came in ragged gasps. Then something moved, not in the book. Behind him, a shadow flickered in the reflection of his computer screen, tall, unnatural, shifting. Cold breath tickled the back of his neck. Daniel didn't turn around. He couldn't, because the book had already told him what he would see. And some things, once seen, could never be unseen. Daniel sat frozen, every muscle in his body locked in place. His breath came in shallow gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could still see the shadow shifting in the dim reflection of his computer screen. It loomed behind him, unnatural in its movements, like a flickering candle flame, distorting and twisting in ways that defied logic. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. He had two choices: turn around and confront whatever stood behind him, or keep his eyes fixed forward, pretending it wasn't there. Neither option felt safe. A whisper broke the silence. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like dry paper being rubbed together. But it came from inside the book. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. His hand trembled as he reached for the book, the leather now slick and warm beneath his fingers, as if it had a pulse of its own. He hesitated before prying the cover open, revealing fresh words written in that deep, red ink. "You are not alone." A sudden gust of cold air rushed through the room, though his windows were closed. The whispering grew louder, and this time, Daniel realized it wasn't coming from the book itself. It was coming from inside the pages. He flipped through frantically, scanning the text, but the words were shifting, rearranging before his very eyes. They bled into one another, reforming into new sentences as if the book was actively thinking. "Why do you fear? Why do you hide? You wanted to know." The whispering turned into a chorus. Low, overlapping voices, some distant, some impossibly close. The words crawled up his arms, burrowing into his ears, embedding themselves into his mind. Daniel staggered back, knocking into his chair. The reflection in his computer screen flickered again, but this time he saw something new. A face. Not his. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. It was watching him just behind his shoulder. Daniel spun around, heart hammering, nothing. Just his dimly lit apartment, silent except for the faint rustling of paper. He exhaled sharply, turning back to the book. It had flipped to a new page, one filled with dense, cramped handwriting. His vision swam as he read the words aloud. Every reader leaves a mark. Every reader leaves a piece of themselves. Now, Daniel Reeves, you belong to the pages. A jolt of pain shot through his temples, and he stumbled, gripping the desk for support. The book was pulsating beneath his hand now, a sickly warmth emanating from its cover. His fingertips tingled, and then the pain spread. His skin burned as if something was being etched into it. He yanked his hand away, staring in horror as dark, inky lines bled through the flesh of his palm, forming words. His name, written in the same red ink that filled the pages. A scream caught in his throat. He staggered backward, knocking into the bookshelf, sending stacks of novels and manuscripts cascading to the floor. His mind raced. What was happening to him? How could ink burn? The whispering rose into a deafening hiss. The book was still writing, and this time it was writing him. Daniel Reeves felt the pain intensify, a searing agony that radiated from his palm as dark. Inky lines continued to crawl up his wrist. The room spun in a feverish haze, the shadows along the walls dancing in time with his ragged breaths. Every instinct in his body screamed to run, yet his legs were rooted to the spot as if held by unseen chains. The book on his desk pulsed with a slow, malevolent heartbeat, a presence that was no longer confined to its leather cover, but had seeped into his very flesh. A cacophony of whispers filled the room, rising from a chorus that seemed to emanate from the very pages of the cursed tome. Their voices overlapped, some soft and pleading, others harsh and triumphant. You are ours. You belong to us. Your story is written in our ink. Daniel's mind reeled, his thoughts splintering into 1,000 desperate questions he could not articulate. The sight of his own name, now etched into his skin in that same deep, red script, sent shock waves of terror through him. He stared at the slowly spreading letters, as if they were a prophecy, a fate written by a hand not entirely his own. The book's pages fluttered violently, as though caught in an invisible storm, and new words began to form before his eyes. They spilled across the page in a script that was at once elegant and maddening, the ink glowing with a sinister light. The blood of the chosen seals the pact. The bound shall walk between worlds, their essence entwined with the cursed, until the final toll of midnight calls. As the words emerged, Daniel's body convulsed. He could feel his heart pounding faster than ever, the rhythm of his pulse matching the unholy cadence of the book. Each beat resonated like a drum, heralding an inevitable doom. In that moment, he understood with horrifying clarity that his life, the collection of every story he had ever chased, had led him to this point. He had become the unwitting scribe of a dark fate. In a desperate bid for control, Daniel tried to tear the book away from himself. He lunged for it, his fingers brushing the trembling cover, but the book seemed to cling to him as if magnetized by his very essence. It was as if the cursed object had grown tendrils, wrapping themselves around his limbs, binding him in an invisible grip that tightened with every passing second. The cold air in the apartment grew heavier, oppressive, as if the room itself were collapsing under the weight of centuries of sorrow. He staggered backward, crashing into his bookshelf. Dust and old manuscripts rained down upon him, and the sound of shattering glass was drowned by the rising chorus of the whispering voices. His mind was a turbulent sea of fear and disbelief. How could a book, an inanimate object, a mere repository of forgotten lore, take control of his very being? And why had it chosen him? A voice, more distinct than the others, pierced through the chaotic murmurs. It was soft, almost tender, yet it carried an undeniable authority. Daniel Reeves, you have been marked. In the pages of this cursed tome, your destiny was sealed long before you ever held it in your hands. He felt as though the words were spoken directly into his skull. They resonated with every fiber of his being, crushing any remaining shred of defiance. His vision blurred, and in that hazy, half-conscious state, he saw images that defied explanation. A labyrinth of endless corridors lined with old, leather-bound books, shadowy figures with eyes like burning coals reaching out to him, and a spectral child, pale, sad, and accusing, standing at the threshold of a crumbling door. The child's eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Daniel knew that the spirit of Elise, the mysterious girl whose tragic disappearance had haunted local lore, was not only present in the cursed book, but was interwoven with his own fate. The realization was both a curse and a revelation. He had become a vessel for memories and maledictions spanning generations, a bridge between the living and the damned. Each heartbeat was now a toll, marking his descent deeper into a realm where the rules of time, life, and death no longer applied. A searing pain shot through his head, and Daniel sank to his knees. The book lay open before him, its pages still writing and rewriting his fate in that terrible, ancient ink. He could feel his thoughts splintering, the boundary between his will and the dark influence of the text dissolving into a nightmarish fog. Every word it wrote pulled him further into the abyss, a relentless tide of despair and inevitability. In a final moment of lucid terror, Daniel screamed, a sound that was raw, anguished, and full of hopeless defiance. He tried to wrench himself free from the invisible bonds, but his limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, as though the very air around him had thickened into something solid and malevolent. The whispering voices swelled, their tones merging into a singular, echoing refrain. There is no escape. The story is eternal. The book's glow intensified, casting sinister red light across the room. It was as if the cursed object had summoned the darkness itself to witness its claim. Daniel's eyes darted around the apartment, desperate for any sign of salvation. A phone call to a friend, a window left open to the promise of cold, indifferent reality, but there was nothing. He was trapped in this moment, his fate sealed by a relic that defied logic and reason. Time lost all meaning as the struggle between his fading self and the overwhelming presence of the book raged on within him. He felt memories that were not his, a cascade of voices, faces, and emotions that were both alien and intimately familiar. The pain in his head receded, replaced by a numb, icy void where his consciousness flickered uncertainly. In that disquieting space between waking and oblivion, he perceived the book's final decree. In the end, every story must be written. And you, Daniel Reeves, are the ink from which the cursed tale flows. A final surge of energy, as if from the depths of an ancient power, forced him upright. His eyes burned with tears of both agony and acceptance. With a trembling hand, he reached once more for the book. This time, however, there was no resistance. The book's grasp on him was absolute, its hold a manifestation of fate beyond mortal defiance. As he opened his eyes to the flickering light of the dying candle on his desk, the room itself seemed to dissolve into a blur of crimson and shadow. The whispers quieted, replaced by a solemn silence that carried the weight of innumerable tragedies. In that suspended moment, Daniel felt the last vestiges of his individual self begin to slip away, merging with the dark narrative that had been written for him long before he ever knew its true nature. He was no longer merely Daniel Reeves, the collector of rare stories and forgotten texts. He had become part of the cursed manuscript, a living testament to the inescapable power of the past. The cursed book's pages turned slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the final chapter of a long, relentless tale. His body, now a vessel for the ancient curse, began to fade into the background, while the red ink on his skin pulsed in time with the book's eternal rhythm. And so, as the final whispers echoed into silence, the cursed tome closed with a soft, almost reluctant sigh. The pages ceased their frantic writing, and in the dim, cold light of that forsaken apartment, only one truth remained. Some stories choose their reader, and some readers become the story. For Daniel Reeves, there was no escape. His fate was sealed in blood and ink, a permanent part of a cursed narrative that would echo through time. The haunted manuscript, now resting on his desk, bore the final words in scalding, relentless red. Daniel Reeves belongs to us. The darkness outside deepened as the cursed book lay silent, its malevolent secret passed on to a soul forever bound to its pages. And in that final, inescapable moment, as the last flicker of light succumbed to the relentless cold, the legacy of the cursed book was complete.